Louisiana Eats is brought to you with support from Zatarain's, maker of New Orleans pantry staples like Creole mustard, fish fry, and jambalaya mix since 1889. Recipes and more at zatarains.com. From our studios in the Southern Food and Beverage Museum in New Orleans, this is Louisiana Eats. I'm Poppy Tooker. What is the difference between a memoir and an autobiography? Publishers see autobiographies as the chronological telling of a whole life, while memoirs focus on a specific incident or time. Both are two of my favorite reads, but the memoirs I love most usually include recipes. That's why I couldn't wait to talk with this week's guests after thoroughly enjoying their books. Author and celebrity caterer Mary Giuliani's most recent book is Tiny Hot Dogs, a memoir in small bites. Mary joins us to discuss everything from her compelling life to those bite-sized hors d'oeuvres she's so famous for. None of Anne Hood's previously published 8 books fall into the food genre, but her most recent, Kitchen Yarns, is an exploration of her life through what she was eating and cooking during the most salient times. Then, we'll wash those memoirs down with some of Troy Ball's moonshine. Her 2017 memoir, Pure Heart, was one of the most riveting, honest tales I've ever read. It's an unflinching look at how a bankrupt mother with 2 profoundly disabled sons found happiness and financial success through North Carolina moonshine. So get ready to turn the pages. It's time for a soul-satisfying read on this week's Louisiana Eats.
My name is Anne Hood, and I'm the author of Kitchen Yarns, Notes on Life, Love, and Food.
For as long as she can remember, Anne Hood wanted to be a writer. A voracious reader growing up, Anne lost herself in novels like Little Women and Dr. Zhivago. While earning her B.A. in English, she fell in love with the works of Willa Cather and F. Scott Fitzgerald. Deciding she needed some adventures to write about, Anne became a flight attendant for TWA and traveled the world. During long international flights, she began working on short stories that would become her first novel, Somewhere Off the Coast of Maine, published in 1987. In the decades since, Anne has become a prolific and best-selling writer, receiving multiple awards for her novels and nonfiction. Her books explore the human condition, frequently drawing upon her own life experiences, including her journey with grief following a terrible family tragedy. In her newest book, Kitchen Yarns, Anne provides readers with stories from her life and the recipes that carried her through its ups and downs. And you're a novelist, you're a food writer, but your memoirs are something really special because of the intimate stories that you tell in that particular form.
Thank you, Poppy. You know, it's so funny because when I wrote my first novel, I also wrote an essay that was in the Washington Post. And my brilliant publicist at the time, you know, here I am, 28 years old. It's my very first novel. She takes me aside and says, "You have got to write memoir." And I thought, who cares about my life? But she was on to something. It's a form I did ultimately take to. And like writing, I like exploring the real things that are happening around me.
Well, you've had a long life in food and a lot of interesting lessons along the way. Tell us about your very, very unusual childhood memories that involve Marilyn Monroe and fried chicken, of all things.
It was such a part of my growing up. Now, I'm from a very large Italian family in Rhode Island. But for several years, my family, because my dad was in the Navy, just the four of us, my brother and my parents and I, lived in Maryland, Annapolis, Maryland, and Arlington, Virginia. And it was my mom's opportunity to sort of not cook Italian food and not be part of this, immigrant family. And she just embraced everything that she thought of as American. And part of that was my dad, who was a Hoosier from Greensburg, Indiana, the fried chicken that his family made. And so to me, when I eat that fried chicken, I think of my, very young years being in the station wagon with my parents and my brother. When you're in the station wagon with your sibling, there's the line in the middle that you can't cross. And there is a cooler, and in that cooler is the fried chicken that my mom and dad spent, all that morning preparing. And we would drive the Blue Ridge Highway. And I just have these wonderful memories of how beautiful it was and being in that car and then pulling over at a picnic table and eating our lunch. And one bite of that fried chicken brings me back there. Because food does that, right? It just takes one smell or one bite and you're back to another part of your life.
It is so evocative, the way food brings it all together. And I always believe that your taste buds are tied to your heartstrings, don't you?
I love that. Absolutely. Absolutely. On one of these trips, we drove to West Virginia to visit my mother's friend, Lottie May. And of course, we stopped. We had our fried chicken picnic, and we were coming back, and the Four Seasons were singing Big Girls Don't Cry. And I heard on the radio, they even interrupted the song to say that Marilyn Monroe had died. And I was a little kid, but I kind of knew she was an actress, famous. My mother started crying. And then it seems like moments later, we were in a pretty bad car accident. We all were fine, ultimately. But that has been like sort of an apocryphal story in my family and to me, all those things together, fried chicken, Four Seasons, West Virginia, and Marilyn Monroe.
And one of the things that I really admired so much about your work is that a lot of people would just tell that tale, and that would be a lovely little tale, and we would all remember. But then, compelled by authenticity, I don't know, you started researching dates, and it turns out your childhood memories kind of all jumbled together.
It's completely wrong. Because the year Marilyn Monroe died, the Four Seasons, that song wasn't out, and we were not on that trip. None of the things line up. And so I was thinking a lot about food and memory and the strange connections that we make from our childhood. But you know what? To me, that all happened that night.
And that's
it
the
will
way
forever be that way. Yeah.
And that's the way it'll always be. Well, there's so many things that I just loved about your book and your whole point of view in life, because you also had a relationship with your father and food.
Well, my mom was a great cook. My dad was a terrible cook who thought he was a great cook. But he understood that thing that we understand, which is, I want to nourish you. Food is love. And so he cooked for me all the time. He cooked very dry pork chops and very oversauced things on the grill, and grilled cheese that were as flat as a pancake. He'd smush them down. He put sugar in his scrambled eggs, which is not always a good idea.
That's odd.
And but he made great mac and cheese, homemade mac and cheese, and I still make that. That is one of my go-to comfort foods.
Well, you are a woman of many lives, many husbands. You're so brave. You just tell us the whole 411. But isn't it a grand thing to have the world view of life that anyone has got a few decades under her belt, as you and I do, has? You were a TWA stewardess, and
I was.
Would you talk to us about Chateaubriand? Because I'll tell you the truth. I'll bet you a bunch of my listeners don't even know what Chateaubriand is.
So imagine I was 21 years old and just out of college, majored in English. How many jobs there are for English majors. And I thought, I have to see the world in order to be a writer. And so I decided to become a flight attendant and happily was hired by TWA because I wanted to see the world. In those days, United and American didn't fly internationally. So it was either TWA or Pan Am if you wanted to fly internationally. And I have to tell you, Poppy, sometimes I tell these stories and people's mouths drop open. They're like, when was this? What are you talking about? In coach, if you were on a flight, say from New York to San Francisco, you got a menu, a choice of 3 entrees. We did a dinner mint service with after dinner drinks, and we'd put dry ice on the cart and
You had
throw
a
water
fog
on it.
machine.
So we'd walk in fog, down the
It was food as theater in the air, wasn't it?
It was. And in first class, and again, this was domestic flights, coast to coast, one of the choices, and the one everybody wanted was Chateaubriand. And I believe it's a tenderloin. You would actually ask the people, how do you want it cooked, medium rare, and then you threw it in that oven and hoped for the best. But you would wheel it out, and it was quite an ordeal back in the galley to set up this cart with the Chateaubriand, and you'd carve it in the aisle, and then it came with Béarnaise sauce that you would spoon on, And then if you did international flights in first class, you dressed the lamb chops with little gold stockings, and then there was a caviar cart, caviar and champagne and chilled vodka.
It must have been the thrill of a lifetime.
It was. I loved that job
I bet.
because I love people and I love to travel, and I liked buying everything at the duty-free shops. So it was perfect.
Well, eventually, though, you marry and you settle down. And I again, kudos. I hope to one day be a girl who can write kindly about my 2 previous marriages. But you've had 3 children in your life, and the stories of your children are so compelling. And anybody who's a fan of yours knows about grace. It takes such grace to be able to write about the death of a child.
Yes. It was something I thought I would never do. In the immediate aftermath of Grace dying, she was 5. This was back in 2002. And she died from a virulent form of strep throat. It was very sudden. And for at least a year, probably 2 years, everybody, knowing that I'm a writer who writes about things that matter to me and personal things, urged me to write. And I thought, I will never write about this. It's too painful. And then one day, someone brought us dinner, as they were doing, and I took a bite, and it was the worst lamb stew I've ever had. And we looked at each other, and we said, this is terrible. And it was a sign that we were moving through to the next phase, like we could taste food again. And it made me think about comfort food, how food comforts us, how simple things comfort us. Emily Post, way back in the 20s, said, if someone is mourning, all you should do is bring them good broth to, rejuvenate and comfort them. And so I wrote an essay about comfort and food. And I wrote another one about knitting, which I took up after Grace died, and knitting and grief. And slowly these essays grew into an actual memoir. But it was something I never set out to do. It's just I'd have this small spark of realizing something new about loss, and I'd want to write about it.
And is there a way that you remember Grace through food?
Absolutely. She was the funniest kid. She always wanted to wear like stripes, and it used to drive my mother crazy. Stripes, polka dot, plaid, you name a pattern, she wanted it on with the other patterns. She wore glasses from the time she was 2, so these little wire rim glasses and bright blue eyes. And her favorite meal was sliced cucumbers and pasta with butter and Parmesan. Not an unusual meal for a 5-year-old, but that was heavenly to her. And when her friends would come over after school, I was instructed to do 2 things: kiwi and Campbell's chicken with soup. And so she had that. Those were her things that I always think of. But I can think of her on her little stool. She used to help me make this apple tart. It's actually in the recipes in the book. She'd stand on her stool, and I'd cut the apples, and she'd put them in the concentric circles, in the introduction, I talk about M.F.K. Fisher a little, the wonderful food writer. And a line that she said in an interview really struck me when I read the interview, but kind of carried with me, and I made sure to put it in the book. She said, when I asked about why she wrote so much about food, she looked surprised, and she said, "I don't write about food. I write about love." And for me, that's, truer words were never spoken. And so that's what I wanted to convey, that throughout love and loss and disappointment and triumph, we always have that, we always have food. And like you said, that wonderful thing, our heartstrings are connected to our taste buds, right? And if you can comfort someone or be comforted with food, then you're going to be okay.
Ann Hood, author of Kitchen Yarns, Notes on Life, Love, and Food. What is the origin of the ubiquitous cocktail party food known as hors d'oeuvres? And what exactly does that mean? Stay tuned, and we'll answer that question when we come right back. I'm Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is brought to you with major support from Camellia Brand, beans done right, a New Orleans tradition since 1923, and from Brennan's Restaurant, home of the original breakfast at Brennan's and flaming Bananas Foster. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, and private events at 417 Royal Street in the French Quarter. Here's this week's culinary quiz question, brought to you with support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen. What is the origin of the ubiquitous cocktail party food known as hors d'oeuvres? And what exactly does that mean? Hors d'oeuvres is a French word whose direct translation means outside the work, which initially makes no sense at all until you examine dining tables of the 17th century, where main courses were placed in succession on the table, but small plates of savory appetizers were placed on the side or outside of the meal's main work. The word first appears in a 1691 publication called The Royal and Bourgeois Cook, where it's explained as certain dishes served in addition to those one might expect in the normal composition of the feast. In late 19th century America, hors d'oeuvres was synonymous with appetizer, the first dish of a multi-course meal. After Prohibition, hors d'oeuvres became standard cocktail party food, where they were sometimes referred to as canapés. But wait, get this. Canapé is the French word for sofa. The story goes that some chef put something savory on a toast round and claimed it sat there like a person does on a sofa. No matter what you call them, canapés or hors d'oeuvres, at our next guest's famous catered affairs, they're often just tiny hot dogs. Let's hear what Mary Giuliani has to say about that.
Hello, I'm Mary Giuliani. I am the owner of Mary Giuliani Catering Events here in New York City, and I am the author of Tiny Hot Dogs, a memoir in small bites.
As an awkward kid growing up on Long Island in the 1980s, Mary Giuliani's dream was to one day become a famous actor, preferably a cast member on Saturday Night Live. Today, Mary plays a different kind of role as caterer to the stars. Famous for her finger food recipes, she regularly works with A-list celebrities in the worlds of fashion, art, and movies. In her book, Tiny Hot Dogs, Mary weaves together a collection of memories from her life while offering a glimpse into the career of a celebrity caterer. We spoke with her by phone to learn more. Could you start off by telling us about the name of the book? Because that alone was a real showstopper for me. Tiny Hot Dogs.
Well, it's everyone's favorite party food. And as a caterer for the last almost 20 years, I realized very quickly that all I needed to do was bring out those hot dogs on a tray, and it's instant happy to a party. But I kind of took it a step further. The book starts in my childhood, where I grew up in a traditional Italian Catholic family home, but in a predominantly Jewish neighborhood. And all I wanted to be was like my friends. So therefore, I just wanted to be Jewish. And so I tried very hard. I went to Hebrew school electively. I attended 178 bar and bat mitzvahs. And no matter how hard I tried, I wasn't successful. And I also was a little bit of an outsider. But at these fancy bar and bat mitzvah events every weekend, I became friends with the caterer who came out every weekend with the tray of pigs in a blanket. And that was where the love affair began. Fast forward to my current career, where I'm a caterer, where I guess you could say I'm still chasing that tray. But I decided to chase the tray because it's shown me glimpses into so many amazing worlds that I would have never normally seen if I didn't make that decision. So the tiny hot dogs, while it might be just a humble little piece of party food to some, has been a lot for me.
So how did you make this transition? Because you didn't set out to be a caterer. As captivated as you were by those tiny hot dogs,
Yep.
catering wasn't your first choice for a career.
No, it was not. I wanted to be an actress. I went to Georgetown University. I studied English. I was an English major and a theater minor. And I left Georgetown, moved right back to New York, and tried to, first I auditioned for the Actors Studio for James Lipton. I was rejected. My classmate, though, got in. Perhaps you've heard of him, Bradley Cooper.
Oh, perhaps.
Yeah, he got in and is doing quite well. And I just, kept waiting online at auditions. And money is running tight, and like many performers in New York City, I took a job in a catering company just to pay the bills. I was just there as a pit stop on my way to, I wanted to be on Saturday Night Live. That was my ultimate goal. And I was there for about a month when it kind of hit me that, oh, wait, maybe this is exactly where I'm supposed to be. It combined, catering and events combined theatrics and creativity and food. And I realized that I was actually quite good at event planning. I come from a long line of, I call them eaters and greeters, from lots of great Italian cooks. And my grandmother was also in the hospitality industry. She owned several hotels. So it all kind of like came back to me. This dream I kind of didn't dream up started to unravel in front of me. And I, decided to trade in the stage for the party and worked for a catering company for 3 years, learned everything, really deeply fell in love with the concept of a hard day's work. And then in 2005, started my own business out of my living room of my apartment. And I'm knocking wood to say 15 years later, we are still in business, and I love it.
Well, what an incredible trajectory that you were on, because I love your stories about how this catering business has taken you from strippers to Harry Potter.
Yep.
That's quite a stretch.
That is a sentence that we can say is absolutely true. I was hired very early on to cater a party for a very fancy stripper, and did it well, and realized that stripper nightclub life was not for me. And then went right on to be hired to do the Harry Potter premiere, which was the largest event at that point I had ever catered, even with my previous company. But the opportunity arrived, and I did the best I could, and it makes for a good chapter in the book.
Well, I love the way your life story takes you on this path, so maybe you don't turn out to be a television or film star yourself, but you sure have been rubbing elbows with them. So,
Yes.
yeah. And so your old classmate, he becomes one of your clients. Tell us
Yes.
about you and Bradley.
Oh, that was really fun because we were friendly in college. I wouldn't say super chums, but I knew him. He had a great reputation, and then years later, I get hired to cater Alyssa Milano's wedding, who was my who's the boss, my childhood imaginary best friend. And if like that's not great enough, one of the guests there was Bradley Cooper, who I hadn't seen since we graduated college, and he had since gone on that first Hangover movie came out, and he was a big star. I was like, he's never going to remember me. He's a big star now. And he walked over to me and said, Marie. And I was like, that's close. It's Mary. And we kind of reconnected. And then from just reconnecting, and of course, he remembers we were at Georgetown together. He then went on to be kind enough to hire me to cater some events for him.
Mary, I want to ask you why you wrote this book, because I'm fascinated right now with this plethora of food memoirs. They seem to be expanding and expanding. Why did you jump into that pond, and why did you write this book?
Well, it's funny. I wanted to jump into that pond before I was allowed to jump in that pond. This is the book I wanted to write. I wanted to write stories. I love the idea of holding a black and white book and reading stories. And if you're lucky, you get a recipe from it or an idea. We all, I say we're all fighting the same. We're all struggling from the same things. It's just we're all wrapped in different, wrapping paper. And so I think the more you can make human connection through stories, I just really wanted to share these stories. And I was really grateful for the opportunity to finally do that.
There's nothing like a good story except maybe a tiny hot dog.
A tiny hot dog.
So,
Poppy, that's great.
Mary, you have just brought the whole thing all together for us. And I hope everybody puts tiny hot dogs on their reading list because the recipes are pretty yummy too.
Thank you so much.
That was Mary Giuliani, author of Tiny Hot Dogs, a memoir in small bites.
I'm Troy Ball, the author of Pure Heart, A Spirited Tale of Grace Gritton Whiskey. I'm also the founder of the first whiskey distillery in America that was created by a woman, and I currently operate Asheville Distilling Company in Asheville, North Carolina.
Troy Ball didn't drink a drop of alcohol until she was 40 years old. Raised in a religious Texas household and educated at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Troy prides herself on her Southern manners. Describing herself as a, quote, Vanderbilt girl, she favors pressed blue jeans and crisp white blouses and never leaves home without her pearl earrings. So how is it that at the age of 50, this charming Southern belle became the first lawful female distiller of traditional Appalachian moonshine in the South? Hers is a tale of personal and financial struggles, unlikely friendships, and a loving mother determined to do what's best for her two special needs sons. Troy, it is an honor to be able to speak with you, and I have to tell you, after reading Pure Heart, I am definitely one of your biggest fans. So welcome to Louisiana Eats.
Thank you so much, Poppy. It always makes my heart warm because I struggled through the writing of that book and probably upset my husband a little bit, too, in the process. But, it's our story. It's the story of raising two special needs sons and coming out of a world that was in many ways confined and finding myself at 50 creating a whiskey distillery.
Troy, your story really begins in Austin, Texas, when you and your husband Charlie had your first son, Marshall, and then Colton. Take us back to that time in Austin and how that huge life occurrence changed your life.
Yes. I was excited to have my first son, Marshall, and my second son, actually. But when Marshall was born, he was sent home from the hospital healthy. They said he has, normal test scores and everything, and he's in good shape. And then he didn't gain weight, and then he didn't learn to hold his head up, and then he didn't learn to roll over. And by the time he was 5 months old, the pediatrician was starting to get a little alarmed that he was not meeting milestones. And I was in complete denial, of course, because I'm thinking, hey, he's just doing things his way, But by the time he was 9 months old, I really had sort of come to realize that there was something not working correctly with Marshall, but they had no diagnosis. And we said, well, if we don't have a diagnosis, we're just going to keep treating him as if he understands everything we're saying and not limit him. That just continue to talk to him and read books to him and treat him as if he was listening. And when he was 2, his second brother, Colton, was born. And Colton, too, was sent home from the hospital healthy and fine. And then by the time he was 5 months of age, he was having seizures, as Marshall was, it turned out. So now I was in my mid-20s, and I had these 2 children who required total care and really round-the-clock care because of their seizures and the fear that, something would happen to them in the middle of the night. Well, because the boys were medically fragile, we just battled with their health. And so the boys would be compromised by allergies, and then they'd get a little virus, and they'd have a pneumonia, and we'd be in the hospital. And then I said, you know what? We just have to try taking the boys someplace else. We'll never forgive ourselves if we didn't try living in a different environment. So we began a hunt for the best small towns in America, did Google searches and all that, and Asheville was showing up on all the lists, and I had never heard of it, but I thought, well, this place keeps showing up. We should drive through there and see what we think. And that's what we did.
You move there, and all of a sudden, a character appears on your doorstep virtually and offers you something called a spider leg. Tell us about Forrest Jarrett and the spider leg.
Oh, my gosh. Forrest Jarrett is larger than life. I mean, he's like from a step back in time. At that time, he was maybe 80, somewhere in his early 80s, and he was a local Madison County man who'd grown up here in the hills, and he eventually became chief of the Southern Railroad. And so he was politically smart, and I think he worked his way right up the chain by handing moonshine out to everybody. And I'm not kidding. Even to this day, he takes moonshine to the politicos. It's like a joke. It's like all in fun. Oh, now don't tell anybody. I brought you some moonshine. That kind of thing. Let's just have a little spider leg. And I was looking at him like, what is this? And he goes, oh, it's just that little bitty drizzle that runs down the side of a glass when you pour the moonshine in the jar. It runs down like they do wine, fine wine.
Yes.
Well, basically, this is the legs, but he calls them the spider legs. So I, opened the jar and took a little tiny sniff, and oh my gosh, it burns your nose hair. And when I put a dab on my tongue, it just burned like crazy, and I put the lid back on and I just stored it. I didn't tell him I didn't drink it because I didn't want to offend him. He was kind to bring it to me. And after a while, these jars are just accumulating at my house because he keeps bringing them. And eventually, I just got my nerve up and I said, Forrest, I really just don't like this moonshine. I think you should give it to somebody who would enjoy it more. And he said, Troy, don't you know the good stuff never leaves the home place? And I'm like, what are you talking about, Forrest? He goes, I'm saying the good stuff is kept at home. So a couple of months go by, and here comes Forrest up in my driveway one day. And he pulls out another jar of moonshine. He says, I've got something special. And I'm like, oh, God, please, not another jar. And he goes, no, this is the keeper kind. I promise. And so I called my sister. I said, you got to come over here because Forrest brought the keeper kind of moonshine, and I want you to taste it. And so she came over that afternoon, and she tasted it, and she says, my gosh, it is good. And so then I had to try it, and I was very surprised by the difference. Mm. And that night I had a group of women friends coming over who were supposed to be learning how to crew from me, and I happened to ask them would they like to try some of this keeper kind of moonshine, and they're like, well, sure. So I bring the jar of moonshine out and some fruit juice, and oh my God, those 5 women drank the whole jar. No kidding. I woke up the next morning, and I thought, I wonder if that kind of white whiskey is on the market. And what made me think of that was something Ross Perot had said years ago. Ross said, if you want to be successful in a business, you need to study an industry and figure out what's missing. And then that's what you need to focus on, because there'll be a demand for something that's not available. And I remembered it that morning, and I thought I should go down and buy whatever's available and taste it. Well, I bought 3 products, brought them home, called my sister and said, come back over. We've got to taste these. And so we tasted the 3 products, and they were not anything like what he had brought us. And that was it. Boy, from that second on, I was on very focused on trying to talk Forrest into introducing me to some men that would teach me how to make this moonshine. I basically ended up on a hunt trying to find somebody who made really good whiskey. And that was difficult because a lot of the guys were just making it kind of more for fun than for trying to create a seriously good product. They weren't personally going to drink it. I learned from these old men up in the mountains that there is a pure heart piece of the distillation. And if you just capture the pure heart of the distillation, you are going to get clean, lovely whiskey that doesn't give you a headache and that tastes wonderful and does not burn your mouth. They were selling the heads and tails and keeping the middle, the hearts, for themselves. When I discovered that, I was like, oh my gosh. When I got home, I went out and I bought a pressure cooker because this guy, Clyde, was using a pressure cooker as a still. And I was like, really? And he goes, yeah, this works fine. So I buy this pressure cooker and I bring it home and I bought the pieces and parts so that we could modify that little pressure cooker and turn it into a still. And once I had done that, then I needed to find some corn.
And you found a really special heirloom variety of corn called Crooked Creek corn. It's just another little bit of serendipity that fell into your lap in the name of John McIntyre.
Yes, John McIntyre's family had it on their family farm for 7 generations.
John then becomes a vital part of your potential business.
Oh, he was like a gift from the gods. I mean, it was John McIntyre is a gentle giant. You know, he's just this lovely, sweet man who's very smart and clever and dependable. And I eventually was able to convince him that if I got a federal permit, could we set up a little test distillery out at his farm? And he agreed once he knew I was going to be legal. Once I got that little permit, we set up the distillery out there, which was only in an 18 by 21 foot building. And it's a small little building. And he would get up at 5 in the morning because that's what time he always got up. So he would start the still. If I wanted to test filtering the whiskey through some sort of exotic charcoal, the next day I'd get there and he would have a bag of charcoal made from cherry wood. I could never have created this distillery without the help of John McIntyre and, for that matter, the help of Forrest Jarrett. I like to say that these are guys with pure hearts, too.
When we come back from a short break, Troy Ball's story continues as her moonshine-making hobby becomes the only hope to save her family from financial ruin. Stay tuned. Poppy Tooker, and you're listening to Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Louisiana Eats is made possible with major support from St. Tammany Parish Tourist Commission. Located 40 minutes from New Orleans' French Quarter, the North Shore's Tammany Taste features the chefs and farmers, brewers and bakers of St. Tammany Parish's culinary scene. Visit LouisianaNorthShore.com to discover more. Louisiana's North Shore, where New Orleans has come to play and get away for more than a century. Additional support for Louisiana Eats comes from Cuba Travel New Orleans, a local travel agency now offering an authentic trip to the acclaimed Havana Jazz Festival in 2020, designed to support the Cuban people through music and arts. Visit CubaNewOrleans.com or call 504-252-9774 to book your trip today. If you're just joining us, we've been speaking with Troy Ball, whose memoir, Pure Heart, tells a very personal story of raising two special needs sons while also, at the age of 50, becoming the first legal female moonshiner in the history of the South. When we last heard from Troy, the year was 2008. She had just received her federal permit and had set up a distillery on her partner John McIntyre's farm in North Carolina. Just as Troy prepared to assemble the final elements needed to take her moonshine to market, the financial markets crashed. Up until then, her husband Charlie had made a good living as a residential real estate developer. But when the real estate market tanked, the family was faced with financial ruin.
It was just terrible. It was terrible. You remember 2008? I mean, how 6 million people in America lost their homes and the real estate market crashed everywhere. Well, we got caught in that. And, I was in the throes of creating the moonshine business when all of this happened. I had already been out there working with the old men. I had already learned to make some moonshine, but basically we were just producing our first 1,000 cases of whiskey when we basically had to leave our home. And it was devastating, and I was traumatized by worrying about what I was going to do with my boys who had to have, a place to live where I could function with them in wheelchairs and I could give them a bath. It's very complicated to have that level of special needs people in your life. You can't just go anywhere and do things simply.
Well, you're such an amazing person, Troy, because now you realize that you've got to somehow really make this business run because you got to take care of everybody, and yet you keep doing the right thing, and the world was just not giving you a break between the still from Germany that's giving you troubles, the bottles turn into a boondoggle, even the labels become a crazy thing, and then the corks give you a surprise.
It was one thing after the next. There's funny things that happened during that, trying to get the distillery open, and intense things that happened. The whole thing was a huge learning curve, and we got through it all. And thankfully, the Pure Heart idea and the concept of making Pure Heart whiskey paid off because people appreciated the quality of the spirit. We had a white spirit that was American-born that could be used in cocktails, and it seemed so logical to me that there could be a rebirth for American white whiskey or moonshine. And we ended up getting our product in some of the kind of coolest restaurants that were around in the South, and also on the big prestigious properties like Disney. So, at the end of the day, despite the fact that we didn't have a clue what we were doing, I didn't have a clue for sure. We worked our way through a lot of struggles, and we produced a product that won gold medals and it makes a killer cocktail. That was my objective.
Well,
who would have thought?
Who would have thought? And who would have thought that the woman who is the first female whiskey distiller in America also has a special needs son who becomes a best-selling author? I mean, talk about a happy ending to a book.
Yeah. Well, Marshall's book was just, he wrote a book, right? It was a compilation of things he had written between the ages of 5 and 10 years. So we went back through all of his notebooks. He selected the pieces, and then they were bound into a book called Kiss of God. And that became a huge bestseller because Oprah Winfrey discovered Marshall's book. I can't even begin to explain the power of that. Instantly the book was a huge bestseller and sold. It was published in 5 languages and sold all over the world. So Marshall just had a re-release of Kiss of God for its 20th anniversary edition.
Incredible.
And I am shocked, really, and happy to say that he cultivated a friendship with Chris Martin from Coldplay. And Chris wrote the introduction to the re-release of Kiss of God. Can you believe that?
No, it's incredible.
It's unbelievably generous of somebody like a rock star like that to take his time to do something like this for Marshall.
Well, it seems to me, now that I know your story as well as I do, thanks to your beautiful book, that your whole life, despite all the adversities that you got handed, God seemed to always have a bushel full of kisses for you, didn't he?
Oh, yeah. It's, there are times in your life when you wonder, right? But it has been rich in content, in love. I have found amazing people scattered around the country who have supported me or Marshall in their ways. And I've had to become a much stronger person because of some of these things. And I think that that's okay. That's what was needed.
Where do we go? Nobody knows.
Troy Ball, founder of Asheville Distilling Company and author of Pure Heart, a spirited tale of grace, grit, and whiskey.
God give me style and give me grace. God put a smile upon my face.
That's it for this week's edition of Louisiana Eats, edible content for Louisiana food lovers. Are you ready for some silly holiday fun mixed with delicious glamour and bottomless mimosas? Join me and some of New Orleans' most talented drag queens at Vessel Nola in Mid-City on Saturday, December 14th. Vessel's beautiful sunny space is perfect for a drag brunch, so put on your jingle bells and let's celebrate the holidays in style. Drag queen style, that is. For tickets, go to Eventbrite. You'll find the link on poppytooker.com, and while you're there, catch up on previous editions of Louisiana Eats, find videos, recipes, and even order personalized cookbooks, too. Louisiana Eats is made possible with major support from Popeye's Louisiana Kitchen, Zatarain's, and from Camellia Brand Beans and the St. Tammany Tourist Commission. Additional support for Louisiana Eats is provided by the Palace Cafe, home of the Weekend Jazz Brunch, featuring a build-your-own Bloody Mary bar, located in the historic Whirline Music Building on Canal Street. Original theme music composed by David Pomerleau and performed by Johnny Sketch and the Dirty Notes. Big thanks to senior producer Joe Schreiner and special projects manager Reggie Morris, and to our business manager and social media maven Maddie Mullidew. Come visit us anytime in our Louisiana Eats studios at the Southern Food and Beverage Museum, We're on Instagram and Facebook too. Louisiana Eats is a production of Poppy Tooker Broadcasting.